Panels 1, 2, and 3 will be held today, and panel 4 and the plenary session will be held tomorrow, the 17th. And so to the conference itself. The global movement against sexual harassment and gender-based violence reflects a sense of urgency, from non-disclosure clauses in workplace contracts to human trafficking, from the precarity of women, non-binary, and trans people in times of crisis to the retracting of state-funded mechanisms of support for them. Governments, corporations, and other systemic structures in almost every part of the world have stood in the way of progress. In the political imaginary, the meaning of justice in cases of sexual violence is usually equated with criminal justice. However, this approach has proved unsatisfactory for many victims and survivors. The systemic flaws in traditional avenues of legal processes raise questions of alternative modes of justice, which will take into account different experiences of survivors in relation to class, race, gender, sexualities, and abilities. The Reykjavík Dialogue Conference will focus on survivor needs by exploring how to develop traditional as well as non-traditional pathways to justice. While demanding state and perpetrator accountability, the goal of the conference is to bring the perspectives of marginalized and vulnerable voices to a discussion of gender-based violence and sexual harassment. The conference brings together survivors, activists, academics, practitioners, and policymakers for panel discussions. The vast and daunting area of discussion that this demands has been broken up into 4 panels. Panel 1 is Restorative, Transformative, and Community Justice. Panel 2 is Colonial and Racial Historical Legacies and Their Impact on Feminist Justice. Panel 3 is Mainstreaming Intersectionality in Strategies for Changing Judicial Systems. And panel 4 will cover Revitalizing Traditional Justice Systems. Panel 1 on Restorative, Transformative, and Community Justice addresses the justice deficit in cases of sexual violence. This panel will explore how to develop non-traditional pathways to justice as part of efforts to center survivors in the process of justice building, where judiciary and due process either fail the survivor or do not respond adequately to their needs. The panel will include discussions on kaleidoscopic justice, survivor justice interests, criminal and civil justice, administrative justice, labor and employment laws, restorative and transformative justice, engaging men, and community-based action. Our panelists are Angelique Nixon, Clare McGlynn, Hildur Fjóla Antonsdóttir, Islah Gyðu, Jessica Mandanda, Julia Downs, and Sotheary. We do hope that you've had the chance to watch or listen to the speaker address by Clare McGlynn, which lays out perspectives on some of the main concerns of the panel. The panel chair is Steinunn Guðjónsdóttir. Steinunn, would you like to come? Steinunn is spokesperson for Stígamót, which is one of the leading organizations in Iceland fighting sexual violence through activism, counseling for survivors, and prevention work. Before joining Stígamót in 2011, Steinunn worked as a liaison officer for UN Women in Japan, as well as the executive director of the UN Women International Committee in Iceland. So before I give the floor to Steinunn and the panelists, I want to remind you all that questions for the panel can be sent in via Slido, that's sli.do, which you can see on the live stream with the virtual platform. If you're using the app, use hashtag 704730 to access the question banks. Steinunn, thank you for getting us all started on this important set of discussions. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in person and virtually. We have a really exciting panel coming up. I would like to thank all our speakers for joining us from different corners of the earth. I believe we have participants based in Palestine, Malawi, the UK, Trinidad, Cambodia, and here in Iceland. Please correct me if there is something wrong, but and we are just so pleased and honored to have you with us today. So in this panel, we will be discussing justice for survivors of gender-based violence, with a particular focus on survivors of sexual violence. What does justice mean for survivors, and how is it attained? As we know too well, the traditional criminal justice system rarely delivers justice to survivors. And cases are often commonly dismissed, and women and all survivors of sexual violence are often just re-traumatized by the process. And too often, no one seems to be accountable for the suffering of the survivors. Feminists have looked at various and created various ways to deliver justice to survivors through other means than the criminal justice system. And we would like to take a closer look at these ideas and these practices here today. Also, can the traditional justice system learn something from other justice-seeking methods and perhaps incorporate some of them? I would like to go around and ask all our panelists to give their opening remarks on our basic questions, which perhaps are what is your approach to survivors' justice interests? What are their needs for justice, and how can they be fulfilled? And maybe we should just go. Clare, can I ask you to begin? And then we will just go around in, well, at least in the order that I have you here on the screen with me. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this important conference, particularly at this moment when we look globally and see what is happening to women across the world, and particularly in Afghanistan. I would like to echo what has been said so far about how survivors' justice interests are so varied and are beyond the criminal justice system as we understand it. My colleagues and I have tried to talk about survivors' justice interests as being kaleidoscopic, meaning that they are ever shifting, ever changing, and that justice is a lived experience. So justice is not something that we can tie down to one conventional criminal justice system. Survivors are seeking many different alternatives through the workplace, through civil law, through transformative justice mechanisms. But I think what we have to hold on to, and again, this has been echoed and said already today, if we are to listen to survivors' voices, that does also mean focusing on the conventional criminal justice system and making sure we seek radical change there as well. We need to recognise all survivors' voices, even though that can sometimes be very challenging and it can sometimes mean that there's a lot of conflict. But we have to do that if we are to seek the ways forward to support the women that we want to help. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, I would like to go to Julia.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you very well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I've got a little prepared thing, which I hope answers your question. So just to say, it's really incredible to be in the company of my fellow panelists and, you know, to talk about the possibilities and have a space to talk about the possibilities of non-traditional pathways to justice that centre survivors. So I arrived to this topic as a survivor, as a researcher, as an activist in Britain. And in my work, I centre survivor experiences and also the kind of ideas around transformative justice frameworks in the work I do to really think about how do we get to that world where gendered harms and things like sexual violence are absolutely unthinkable. How do we get there? I know this is a goal of many of us today as activists, survivors and workers in a global movement against violence against women and girls. And sometimes I know for me, I often look at our social movements and our histories to really think about how do we connect with each other and how do we access those ways of thinking differently, dreaming differently and being differently and finding justice. And so I suppose for me, the first point to make really is that transformative justice, also known as community accountability approaches, is a political framework that's been developed in movements and struggles for Black and racially minoritized lives, Aboriginal and Indigenous lives, by sex workers, by disability activists and LGBTQI communities, for whom criminal justice interventions can decrease safety and deepen harm. So this is really where these ideas are coming from. So they're not new ideas. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that work, legacy and labour, and how that's really allowed many of us here today to start thinking about how to expand our imaginations and how we think about and how do we respond to gender-based violence. So some of the work that I've done has been with white-dominated social justice movements in the British left. And in that work, I talked about something called the criminal legal imagination. And that really relates to B.B. Kim's concept of carceral creep, which some people might be familiar with, but that really describes how, as social movements, we can use legal logics to leverage movement goals. Now, the punitive logic that threads through traditional pathways to justice can also be carried into attempts to create non-traditional pathways. So these things aren't linear or distinct, they creep into each other, and it's up to us to find a way through. So when activists were confronted with accounts of violation and harm that broke with the social justice values claimed in these spaces and communities, so here I'm talking about activist on activist, sexual violence and gendered harms, this punitive logic took hold. It was kind of irresistible. There's an emotional investment in punishment. And this resulted in responses that ultimately deepened the harm and isolation that survivors experienced. And so through that learning, my key takeaway really was that the conditions are just not in place within these distinctive communities and cultures to enable transformative justice work or a different imagination to take root. And really, it's not easy to translate these principles without doing the deeper work of reckoning with whiteness and white supremacy. So thinking more broadly then about our anti-violence work, the same kind of criminal justice imagination can easily take root here. So whereas we know we do the important harm reduction work of doing advocacy with survivors and navigating traditional pathways to justice, and the efforts made to inform and reform policy to better meet the needs of some survivors, this can increasingly leave us ending up in a funding trap and a difficult entanglement with state interests and institutions. This can narrow our time and energy and imagination for what else is being done and what else could be built. However, in exploring the archives of British feminist anti-violence movements, there are glimmers of experiments, questions and challenges to this idea that a conventional criminal justice system could ever deliver justice for women. This has always been a part of the movement, these kinds of ideas and debates. So, but how do we actually do it? And this is where I get stuck in the work. It's like, well, how do we do it practically? Which is why I'm so grateful for the space today to talk about that. And so I suppose I always return back to the definition of transformative justice offered by disability activist Mia Mingus. And Mia reminds us that a focus in transformative justice is to, and I quote, actively cultivate the things we know prevent violence, such as healing, accountability, resilience, and safety for all involved, end quote. So what do we need to cultivate in our movement and in our everyday lives to take those steps towards the world that we want to be in? And so here's a few suggestions for skills from a collective wisdom, which I'm hoping everybody will be able to contribute here today. So really start with yourself. So here I'm talking about centred self-accountability for survivors. And here I'm thinking about the work done by Shannon Perez-Darby. Remember that collective problems require collective solutions. So how do we find and use methods that reveal a shared collective interest in ending violence within a community? And here, Anne Rousseau's work on community support circles, I think, is really interesting and important. How do we nurture the skills to create and strengthen relationships with each other? So doing that difficult work of sitting with feelings, not jumping to resolution, active listening, figuring out our needs, others' needs and boundaries, and addressing small harms. So maybe Kim, as well as Mia Mingus, talk about this idea of we're not going to be ready to, confront the serious harms without doing the small harms first and building up our accountability muscle. How do we have find tools to help individuals to develop networks of safety? So here looking at Mia Mingus's pod mapping as a potential solution, and also ways to look out for each other and interrupt harm. And here I was really touched by what Cradle Community did around how to be an active bystander during lockdown to help people who are being targeted by the police. And really, the final one is accept yours and others' mistakes, prioritising learning over perfection, shame or defensiveness. And I always return back to Adrienne Marie's really broad statement, it's never a failure, it's always a lesson. So thank you. That was my kind of opening statement. And I look forward to learning so much more from the collective wisdom of everybody here today. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to give the mic to Sotheary. Yeah. We are discussing what are survivors' justice interests and what ways are available to bring justice to survivors. Can you?
Okay. Thank you.
There we go.
There we go. Greetings from my dark background from Cambodia. It's 7 p.m. I would love to start with a saying in here that we often hear, is that men are pure gold and women are white cloth. I speak about this, I mentioned this saying because the white cloth means if something make it dirty, if something happened to make your cloth dirty, it's always stained when you wash it. And it's a lot, this word's a lot attached to women, especially women of sexual abuse. Never be her again. That's what it means. Yes. When I worked with survivors of sexual abuse in crimes, you may hear the Khmer Rouge that happened here back in 1975 to 79, a civil war and a criminal war happened here. That still remains a lot of questions from young people, that why did it happen? Why Cambodian killed Cambodia? This is still a remaining questions while we're doing, while we still having the hybrid courts in here in this in our space in Cambodia. I'm a psychologist. I have worked with survivors since the beginning of the tribunals back to 2006, and I hear a lot of words from survivors. What is justice? What does justice means to them? Allow me to relate to the word, to saying again that women are white cloths. It's again, when we hear this, it's a blaming inside. It's responsibility that we should not responsible. It's not our actions if we were the victims, but it's a blaming. It tells that women are not. It tells a lot, and even now in the society, young women in university students, when I have dialogue with them, conversations with them, they say women are raped because they do not cover their body enough. This is the most recent words I spoke to young people. So from them to transform from blaming. Justice for women that is not just limited to justice in the court, like the hearing, but they also want hearing outside of courts. That means they want to be heard, they want to be accepted. And accepted here, I refer to accepted in him or herself and accepted by society. And again, this get back into a blaming culture, a culture of blaming victims again. So, and for me as a psychologist working with them, going through the being heard, accepted, they are able to move on. And to move on here means to move from feeling a victim to being able to say, yes, I survived it. I'm not a victim anymore. I have enough power. I had enough power and courage to move on, to win over the trauma I experienced. And creative, to work with sexual abuse survivors. Here I don't limit to females, but males as well, there are. I always encourage my colleagues and friends here and projects outside as well, whom I connect to create, to work, to have a innovative or creative work with them. That means include them, including arts, including whatever fit to them, rather than just one way. So, and I urge for trauma-sensitive projects when everyone's worked with survivors of sexual abuse or any other abuse as well, not just only sexual abuse, but here in the stage we really have to be very careful. It is a very personal trauma. And so far, I'm also a psychotherapist by practice. So far, I find it very difficult. I find it that my clients who experience sexual abuse they take longer time to heal. Let's say that. Thank you. I'm looking forward to continue our conversations.
Thank you so much. And Hildur, Fjóla, I would like to move over to you, sitting here on the stage with me.
Yes.
What is your approach, and what do you know about the justice interests of survivors?
Yes, I come at this topic so I did my PhD on kind of how survivors kind of imagine justice, survivors of sexual violence. How do they kind of foresee, or how do they envision justice? What does justice mean to survivors? So that's kind of my kind of empirical background coming into this. And I did quite a few interviews with survivors, asking them about their experiences and about kind of these questions. And since then, I've been doing a lot of thinking about kind of the policy implications. How can we transform kind of survivors' needs and justice interests into something concrete? And I think, at least kind of talking in the Icelandic context, there are so many things that we can do. And there are so many avenues of kind of possibilities where we can kind of move forward on this. And I would like to say I very much agree with Clare McGlynn in her opening address in terms of we need to think in a pluralistic way. We need to think about a lot of different kind of avenues and pathways to justice, because we know that survivors' justice interests are varied to a degree, and also their interests can change over time as well. So we need more pathways. And at the same time, we also need to think about the criminal justice system, and we have to continue to improve that system. And I think, again, in the Icelandic context, we can definitely improve that system by strengthening the legal status and rights of victims within that system. Victims are very marginalized in the criminal justice system, have very limited rights, and that's the case in many countries as well. So that's kind of an area we can very much move forward on. We can also kind of develop a civil justice option, so we can develop the tort law option in a way that is more responsive to survivors' needs, and also by kind of incorporating state support into that framework, because of course there's too much financial risk for survivors to enter into a tort lawsuit. It's a lot of financial risk. So if the state would step in there and offer legal aid and also guarantee any awards made, I think we can actually create that possibility into something that can meet some of survivors' justice interests. Because legal recognition for many is very important. And then I think, and again speaking from the Icelandic context, I think restorative justice is something that we need to look at as well. Based on my interviews with survivors, kind of people generally view restorative justice, kind of the ideology of it in a favorable light, but don't necessarily see how it's supposed to kind of function well in practice. So there's it's very important to ensure safety and minimize risk in that process. So we need to create restorative justice programs that are survivor-centered and also feminist-informed, or informed by feminist critique. And we do have some models of that elsewhere in the world, like in New Zealand. I know that one of the panelists is from New Zealand. So that's also, I think, a possibility. And I would say also, again, speaking in the Icelandic context, that even if, when I talked to survivors, I think that was in 2015 when I did my study, survivors would be hesitant when it came to restorative justice, and they would say, you know, I'm afraid that the perpetrator is going to abuse or use this process to just further victimize me. So kind of what has changed a little bit since then, and what they also said is why would perpetrators want to enter into a restorative justice process where they are going to accept responsibility for their actions, you know, because we know that perpetrators mostly deny all accusations and have no indication of taking responsibility. But I think, and I think here is where Me Too has made a bit of a change, at least in the Icelandic context, in terms of there's seemingly offenders are more ready to take responsibility, at least up to a point, than I think they were before Me Too. At least we see some samples of that, not obviously all offenders at all, but we see some signs of that. So I think now, again, in the Icelandic context, there might be, it might be meaningful to start to think about restorative justice in this context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hildur. And now I would like to move to Angelique.
Hello, everyone. Good morning from Trinidad and Tobago, where I am. It's quite early. Thank you so much for including me in this panel this morning, and good morning to my fellow panelists and speakers. My opening comments and to spark conversations, and thanks to everyone who's been, you know, giving us so much to think about. So I want to talk about a few things from the perspective of the Caribbean region. And I want to say that first, survivor justice in this region, like others, means starting with really a complete transformation of our systems. So we must begin with education, with healthcare, with the legal system. And I want to say that it's not only survivors, yes, absolutely lack access to justice, but so do many people across this region, which is, of course, post-colonial, colonial, and neo-colonial. And some of you, I'm sure many of you have heard about the earthquake that just happened in Haiti. And I just want to take a moment to send out healing light for those who are going through so much right now. I spent many years doing work in Haiti, and so I think that for me and my own politics and my work, so much of our Caribbean region has to be rooted in how we think about justice for Haiti in particular, and how we think about our revolutions and forms of resistance and the kind of neo-colonial and imperial pressures and powers and control that still impact so many of our countries, and quite frankly, limit our access to justice. And so when we think about a lack of justice, we have to think about how many people experience such intense and severe inability to access justice from even within countries that have had systems. They remain very colonial and they benefit far too few. People in power, people with connections, people with money, and quite frankly, people who still remain very invested in colonial structures of power and privilege. And those things, of course, are connected to and completely invested in systems of class, racial hierarchy, and color hierarchy, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, ability, religion, and so on, of course. We've heard already today about how important an intersectional analysis and approach is to justice. And so I want to say that, as others have said today, but I want to center what transformation, but what does transformation mean for spaces that are post-colonial and neo-colonial and dealing with continued structures of power relations that are completely unjust and unjust. And so I call for, and in my work, I've called for decolonial healing justice. And I believe that that kind of transformation, transformative justice, must be led by those most impacted. And of course, that intersectional approach to how we do human rights work, how we think about social justice, how we think about environmental justice and ecological justice in these moments remain key. And as Audre Lorde said so many times to us, that we have to figure out ways to bridge our differences and build across our differences in ways that highlight and reflect our complexity. And so how do we then develop these community-based solutions? How do we think about being rooted in safety and doing no harm? How can we be led by those most impacted? In my work in Trinidad and Tobago and across the Caribbean region, I've developed my work in different kinds of pathways. And so I am a teacher and I do research at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at University of the West Indies. For me, that's one way, how we teach, how we talk about these issues, from LGBTI rights to women's rights, to how we think about that in relationship to the environment and to ourselves, how we understand our histories and herstories. I also have had a long and personal investment in creative writing and art as a healing practice. I firmly believe that we must start with healing, and I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. Another way that I've done this kind of work, and I believe is a good model for us to think about those, especially who are, if we're a part of institutions, of educational institutions and research institutions, how do we ensure that our research is impactful to the communities that we are writing about? 4 years ago, I worked with 6 LGBTI and feminist organizations to secure a human rights grant from the European Union here in Trinidad and Tobago. And we used that European Union money to support the work of civil society organizations on the ground to invest in approaches to gender-based violence and to LGBTI discrimination. I think that is a really good model to think about. How do we use colonial funds? And quite frankly, those are monies that we helped build and invest in, and we created that wealth that the European Union and the global North continue to benefit from. So let's use those resources and do something with it that benefits folks at the community level and benefits our institutions. And so we created a project. There was a huge team of us, about 10 people. We created something called a Sexual Culture of Justice, which was a human rights activity-based project for 4 years, working on transforming our approaches and investing in local and regional ideas about how we confront gender-based violence and how do we address LGBTI discrimination and violence. And one of the main, one of our transformative ideas, or ideas for change, our theories for change, is that we have to begin with culture. How do we create and transform the harmful cultural and sexual norms that contribute to gender-based violence, that contribute to sexism and homophobia and transphobia, and how those then intersect with classism and with other systems of oppression, racial ability, religion, and so on. So we took a very intersectional approach in that work. We did all kinds of activities, too much to describe all here, but I would invite you all to just check out our portal. It's portal.caribbeansexualities.org to see the work that we've done over the past 4 years. And a third way that I want to highlight is that for my own work, we think about, how do we think about abolition organizing, right? That's been another thread of my work. as well as anti-violence work in the context of women's rights, LGBTI rights and activism, and most importantly, survivor empowerment. One of my challenges as a survivor has been to think about how do you have an abolition-centered approach when you have a criminal justice system that is unjust and that does not provide access to justice. So one of the things that I want to share just briefly, my process, and then I will wrap up, but to say that I had to start with self, right? As a survivor of child sexual abuse, I had to deal with the harm and also speaking out in my family. And I had the privilege as a light-skinned Black woman with you know, going off, and I was able to go to university. I had a scholarship. And through that process, I was able to really share and talk about my experience. But as a young person, I wasn't able to do that. It takes great risk to speak out as a survivor. And I want to say that I do think, at least from my own work, I think that a part of supporting survivors is to ensure that people are able to have the safety and really the support systems to do the kind of healing work they need. Every survivor's process is different, and I think that's what makes our conversation today so difficult. You have some survivors who want to go through the criminal justice system. You have other survivors who don't want to do that. One of the things that we've talked a lot about in moving to Trinidad and Tobago for the past 6 years of my organizing work here, and also I'm from the Bahamas, and growing up in the Bahamas, in small communities, it's very difficult to think about using a justice system because so many people know issues of privacy and confidentiality happen. One of the things that I've done, I ended up writing about issues around the Sex Offender Registry. I wanted to share this as an example of the challenges of thinking about how we talk about empowerment justice. And so I wrote in 2019 in Trinidad and Tobago, there were conversations about a sex offender registry. And so I shared in newspaper articles as well as during a hearing with the Joint Select Committee with the government of Trinidad and Tobago in Parliament. There was a conversation and a debate about this registry. And I spoke out against it and saying, listen, I wonder if, you know, where are the voices of those who've experienced sexual violence? What about those who have experienced sexual abuse at the hands of family members? What do we think about justice and accountability from a system that's really tried to silence us? And so I talked about, and I think deeply, continue to think deeply about what are these best forms of justice? How do we think about that in relationship to family? And how do we think about that in relationship to safety? And so, of course, in my training and work around restorative justice strategies, I've been able to think through that. And I think that's where we really need to talk through what does accountability look like and how do we develop community-based solutions. So often as a survivor of gender-based violence, you know, we're thinking about how do we find healing? How do we think about ways to even understand justice? And so for me, I want us to think about what are rehabilitative restorative justice programs that can help take into account the various ways that we, especially in our Caribbean region, that we're dealing with criminal justice systems that so often fail, and they fail really the majority of people. And I have said again and again and spoken out publicly that a register of and in itself doesn't make us safe when a legal system is not actually offering or providing justice. And so the LGBT activists, as well as women's rights activists in Trinidad and Tobago, have been calling for a register, not just a register, but a register that accompanies a very clear rehabilitative approach and a system, an investment in legal systems that actually work, and really thinking about how do we get at the root causes of violence. And so I wanted to just share then finally that for me, when we talk about abolition and when we talk about rehabilitative practices, and then when we also talk about a lack of justice, we have to begin with a conversation and an investment in decolonial approaches. And that means, yes, absolutely, taking an intersectional approach and thinking about a multifaceted and, of course, a holistic approach to justice. And I just want to close by also saying in my work with the civil society organization, CAISO, Sex and Gender Justice, I am a director here in Trinidad and Tobago, and we do a lot of regional work as well. And in my capacity as the Caribbean regional facilitator of our GBV dialogue for this dialogue, you know, when we talk about community-based solutions, we absolutely have to prioritize those who are most impacted and offer spaces for us to have those very difficult and challenging conversations. And we also need to prioritize healing, as I've said before, decolonial healing justice as absolutely the beginning, where we start with self and we extend that to community. And that is where I think we can actually begin with our transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We would next like to move to Jessica.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me quite clearly.
Yeah, I think it's okay.
Okay. All right. Firstly, I would just like to thank you for having me on this platform. And also, I think I would like to start off by saying it is such a bittersweet moment to be here in this space, to have these very crucial discussion, particularly because, you know, a few days ago, on Saturday to be exact, the feminist movement in Malawi woke up to an alarming report from the Malawi Police Service, you know, rebutting the facts of one of the worst cases of sexual violence that we've had as a nation. And, you know, stating that so this particular case was where members of the Malawi Police Service raped and defiled 17 women and girls in 2019. And this particular case took public uproar regionally, nationally, and of course, international attention. It took several protests, and it took a lot of lobbying and advocacy, and a lot of, you know, us screaming and shouting to the government for them to do something, for the justice system in Malawi to literally just do their job. And now, you know, we finally have a ruling almost 2 years later where the Malawi Police Service has been asked to you know, compensate the women and girls who are raped and defiled by members of the police service. And now that they have to, you know, they're being held accountable, they are rebutting the ruling by releasing a report that was nullified 2 years ago. And, you know, what that tells me is that after all these years, we still need to have this discussion in 2021. And each day as I wake up, I walk down the streets of Malawi, I still meet men and boys who, you know, who say so many disrespectful things to me, and who say so many disrespectful things to me about my body, because they have this societal given audacity, which is the same audacity that these members of the Malawi police had when they were defiling and raping these women and girls. And, you know, going further, that also tells me that in as much as we have lobbied and in as much as we have begged and asked for, you know, our different governments to just do the right thing, we still have a long way to go. And I say this specifically, you know, for Malawi, that we have begged our governments, we have cried, we have died, you know, women and girls have died, and the government still does not simply understand that we have had enough of the violence. In the last year, while the whole world has been grappling with this global pandemic, various African governments, such as, you know, the Malawian government, has found this entirely new excuse. You know, especially the newly elected government, they found this new excuse to further violate women by taking funding that was supposed to be allocated for ending violence against women and reallocating it to the COVID-19 response, which, by the way, Malawi is doing poorly at. And, you know, on top of that, they have taken funding from the Ministry of Gender and Departments of Gender that deal with violence against women. And these departments are already grossly underfunded because a lot of the money is allocated to the justice system, which does not service women at all. And what we have now in Malawi is increasing rates of sexual violence. And the government of Malawi simply says, well, you know, we have all these cases of violence because of COVID-19, when that is not true. The violence has always been there. The government of Malawi has completely ignored for so many years that women and girls are being violated. And now COVID-19 has just given them an entirely new excuse to, you know, continue saying, oh no, we know there's violence, but, you know, we're trying our best to do something about it, but they're not really doing anything. And I should say, I get excited to see and speak in platforms such as these, because not only is this a great opportunity to discuss new solutions or maybe revive already existing solutions, but it gives me an opportunity to remove that curtain and to, in a way, show the world and maybe expose what the Malawian government is doing to Malawian women. And, you know, we have done our best as civil society, as activists, as feminists. We have so many interventions, but it really boils down to the leaders that we have elected into our governments. It boils down to how patriarchal they are. As a country, Malawi, as well as other countries in the SADC region, one of the things that we claim the most, and one of the things we shelter the most, is this culture that we claim is ours, but is really not ours because the cultures that we have are very similar because we're colonized by the same people. And so, you know, our colonizers left us with this culture that, you know, that embraced the victim blaming, that embraced the perpetual violence against women. And so our leaders have taken that on to this day. Malawi has a penal code from 1930, which we shelter. In that penal code, there's so many, you know, provisions in there that allude to victim blaming. And in 2021, we have been preaching and we have been, you know, we've been introducing new policies that the government simply does not care about because we have this ingrained colonial structure in us that we have claimed is our culture for so many years, and nothing has changed. And so I would really, while I embrace, you know, the different approaches to activism and the different approaches to advocacy for ending violence, particularly sexual violence, at this point, with everything that is happening, and, you know, with waking up every day to a new case of a little baby being violated by, you know, their father, I think what I would like to see and what I would like to you know, discuss and what I would like to develop for Malawi is a very disruptive and very radical approach, because it seems that governments, a lot of African governments, respond to disruption and respond to radicalism. And, you know, I think that's where we need to go. We have had so many, you know, advocacy campaigns that are very respectable and very quiet, and we want to sit down and have a discussion with our leaders, but that has not worked, and respectability feminism in Malawi has not worked. And I think we are tired of it. And I would like for us today to discuss, how do we ingrain and how do we incorporate disruption and radicalism, you know, as a way forward for, you know, restorative justice, and how do we bring that to the table as something that we absolutely need to do, especially for countries like Malawi in the SADC region. And this comes as a very opportune discussion, as well as we're having this SADC Heads of State Summit, where pretty much they come and share, you know, the different facades of how they're doing well as leaders of countries. But in reality, SADC countries are not doing well, and women are dying, and women are being raped and defiled every single day. And leaders of our nations continue to have these platforms where they ignore the issues we had to push to even have side events that are being termed gender side events, where we can bring issues of sexual violence to the table, because that is not something our leaders are willing to discuss. So I am very excited to be, you know, a part of this discussion and to be in this space to just see how we can, you know, find a new way forward. Because for my country, Malawi, we definitely need something to shake up the tables. We need our leaders to listen to us. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And now we'll move on to our last panelist, last but not least, Islah. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much for this very interesting gathering. I would like to thank the organizers and all my colleagues in the panel. I will speak from the context of the Palestinian situation in which many structures of oppression intertwine together to impede, in fact, or to hinder the realization of justice for violence survivors. Since violence is an integral part of our daily life, and as I said, it is intertwined with many layers and many structures. The studies we conducted on the killing of women or femicide in the Palestinian society have indicated that there is an interrelationship between the formal Israeli institutions, such as the police, the public prosecutors, social welfare offices, etc., and the informal social institutions, such as communal reconciliation committees and the religious system and the family. So this interrelationship between so many structures of oppression, it becomes very difficult to realize a restorative justice or a comprehensive justice for the survival of violence in our society. So the starting point in our context is to understand and to study the different layers of injustices in our society in order to know how to confront each of these layers, not separately, of course, but to develop like a comprehensive strategy to face these different layers of violence and oppression. In this sense, violence becomes a very complex political, moral, and ethical issue, but also the burning questions we face in our everyday work, as I mentioned before, is how to address and respond to violence against Palestinian women inside the Israeli society and inside the occupied Palestinian territories. Especially, we are faced by many, what we term many cultural justification or culturalization of the question of violence. How the killing of women in our colonized context can be portrayed is something we struggle with every day. For example, for over 15 years, Palestinian feminists have insisted on using the term of femicide or the killing of women. Why is that? Because the Israeli term of any killed woman used is honor crimes. It's honor crimes. You know, any killed woman, she is put immediately under the term of honor crimes, so as to refuse legitimization and justification that bestow honor on killers and abusers. The concept of femicide in Palestine, including in the West Bank and Gaza, was first invoked by my colleague Nadira Shalhoub-Koverkian. The term has allowed us as feminist supporters and legal activists to work with family members who can be of help to women who have suffered from violence, to activate potential resources and to mobilize internal familial rejection of the crime of killing one's sister or mother or female relative. So the first challenge was to challenge the language used by oppressors inside and outside the family that can draw people together. As feminist activists, we believe that language and naming have consequences. One reason we resist the use of honor crime is that every time a Palestinian female is killed, as I said, it is put under honor crime. The Israeli system's use of this term becomes a tool to culturalize and dismiss the gravity of killing Palestinian women. Culturalization not only lifts the responsibility from the criminal justice system to protect abused women, but also allows the Israeli system to position itself as superior, as belonging to a more modern and advanced culture. You know, as my colleague Angelique mentioned, white supremacy here is very much in place. Scholars of colonialism remind us that colonizers will make any effort to destroy and fragment the internal cohesion and social structure of the colonized. Internal violence is, in this context, is an optimal way to destroy the collective consciousness of the colonized, keep them far from requesting freedom or resisting their colonization. As such, we, as I said, that we have to understand the structures of oppression. As such, we don't rely in our context on the legal system in place, because this legal system, it's supposed to be belonging to a sovereign entity, which is a Palestinian state. But we don't have this, you know, privilege, since according to what is termed as the Oslo Agreement, the Palestinian territory under the Israeli occupation is fragmented into 3 zones. Zone 1 under the total quality, not really the total, but the so-called total control of the Palestinian Authority. Zone B, joint control by the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority. And Zone C is under the total control of the Israeli Authority. The division, the division of the land into these different zones, it means that it is impossible to have a unified rule of law that is governing the communities, whether in area A or B or C. As such, we can see perpetrators, for example, committing a crime in area B and going to hide in area C, or going to hide in Israel proper. As such, the legal system in place by the Palestinian Authority is incapacitated and becomes impossible to realize justice for the survivors of violence or the victims of violence. In this situation, what we can do? In the Palestinian context, it is impossible to speak about a comprehensive justice system or a comprehensive justice, you know, in a clear way, without abolishing the different structures of oppression. That starts by the abolition of the colonial power in place, whether exercised by the Israeli army or its settler colonialists invading the land and destroying the daily life of the Palestinian at all levels. So this means that the international justice should be seek to realize some justice for the victims of this colonial violence. We have pregnant women have been shot at their belly and lost their babies and lost their wombs altogether, which it means that they will never be able to make to reproduce again in their lifetime. We have women have been attacked in inside the Israeli prisons, that the jailers, they use sexual harassment as a systematic tool for intimidation and breaking the will of the Palestinians, that leaves very deep psychological scars on them. In this sense, I will not, of course, outline all the different forms of violence exercised on the bodies of Palestinian women, including the dead bodies of women that they are kept in the refrigerator for years inside Israeli institutions as a collective punishment to their families and to their communities. We have the phenomenon of the frozen bodies that once when killed, the body is kept in freezing condition for very long times, and they use bargaining power to blackmail the families to concede on certain terms. So international seeking justice through international institutions for justice is a must for the Palestinian case. Then becomes the other forms of justice. From our experiences, the most effective ways to realize women's needs and interest in justice is to work with the family and the community. Of course, at the individual level first, and then the familial level, and third, the community level. For example, women prisoners that used to be sexually harassed in the Israeli prisons, at the first experiences, women were ashamed, to face their community or to face their family, and they were silent and refused to speak about what happened to them. But through activating community support and through mobilizing political parties, these political parties played a crucial role in sensitizing and mobilizing the community to be of great support for these women and treat them as heroes, not as something to be ashamed of. So that was a very important, tool to face the sexual violence inside Israeli prisons. As for the violence coming from the family or the community, women's groups, politicized and feminist activists form different groups to urge the victim always to speak up, because the most difficult step is to urge the women or to encourage or empower the women to speak up and to tell what happened. Whether in the family or in the workplace or in their community. So working with the women at the individual level is very important through the different organizations, feminist organizations giving support to women, and then working with the community to treat these women and to heal their wounds in a collective manner, and to respect the fact that they have the courage to speak up and to tell about what happened to them. So restorative justice is possible through the family, through working with the individual, working with the family, and working with the community. And I stop here. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we've been able to hear from all of our panelists. It's such a broad and diverse group of experts. We have talked about what do survivors see as justice and what do they need in terms of justice. And you have mentioned things as prevention, space for healing, accountability, safety for survivors, being heard, be accepted by society, be able to move on, moving from victim to survivor, have some legal recognition, and have education systems and healthcare systems that are survivor-friendly. That we have to begin with culture, that we have to be able to speak out in the family and provide safety to do healing work. So we mentioned all of these different needs that survivors have and that they define as justice. And I would like to ask our panelists a little bit more about the solutions. We have mentioned that collective problems require collective solutions. You have spoken about the support to grassroots organizations, and that it's important that this justice work is led by those that are most impacted. And and we have also spoken about the financial risk for survivors when they're seeking justice. And so I would like to ask our panelists a little bit more about solutions. How can survivors access justice? What has experience taught us about all those alternative ways that we have said some of you have described already? Are they safe? Do they work? How do they meet survivors' needs? Maybe some examples from your work or your research. And maybe also, what are the challenges in establishing some alternative pathways to justice? I know that these are really big and broad questions, and we have the 7 of you here. So maybe if one of you would like to jump in, maybe some of you that have something that you would like to share on this. And I would also like to remind the audience that we do have the Slido, that you are able to ask questions to the panelists through Slido. I don't know if we will have time to answer all of them, but maybe if some of the panelists would like to jump in and talk a little bit more and give examples of alternative solutions and how we provide justice to survivors of violence. Okay, no one is ready to go ahead. Yeah, Sotheary?
I can start?
Yeah.
Yes, I can start. I try to keep it short so our dear colleagues in the panels can share. I recently write trauma-informed book for projects. For those NGOs and for those who designed and projects that works with survivors, actually. And in one of my recommendations is that to make sure that the justice is not just something to give, the justice has to be from that person. So consultations is included there. Asking what's the need for them. I also use the word that if you ask them, you benefit a lot. You know what the real needs is, and what is the word? Like as a psychologist, I said creating an environment opposite from what they experience, the traumas. Mm-hmm. When they experience the traumas, being human being, being a woman, being herself is taken away. That's why she was abused, that was raped. So make her or him feel that the room she sits in, the project she joins is hers, is him, is his initiative, is what she takes part in. So that's part of empowering for me. So yes, consultations is needed instead of here's the justice I want to give to you. It's impossible to do that. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Floors to you.
Mm-hmm. Would anyone else like to? Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, Angelique.
Thank you. I wanted to share about some of the work that CAISO, Sex and Gender Justice, is doing in Trinidad and Tobago. We are a feminist and LGBTI civil society organization working towards wholeness, inclusion, and justice for LGBTI plus people living in Trinidad and Tobago. So we started a program called Wholeness and Justice, and it expands access to wholeness, justice, health, and human services to intersex, trans, bisexual, lesbian, and gay people living in Trinidad and Tobago. And we respond to various violations that community members in any kind of human rights violation. So this, of course, includes gender-based violence. It includes different kinds of experiences and lack, the ways that, in particular, LGBTI people experience a lack of justice in terms of the law, healthcare, employment, housing, and a variety of other issues. So one of what we do is that we offer psychosocial services through very importantly clinically competent and trauma-informed interventions that enable healing and resilience. We work to reduce vulnerability, and we work to strengthen individual self-advocacy, justice-seeking, and community mutual action and vigilance. And so we work through both, we have a community lawyer, we have a caseworker, and we have a clinical trauma, professional trauma certified social worker who works with our clients in order to push our systems to be more responsive and just. So we start with the clients themselves, and we work within and sometimes fight against the systems in Trinidad and Tobago that are not working for LGBTI plus people who, of course, as we all know, experience violence, gender-based violence, and sexual violence, and a lack of access to justice disproportionately because of sex and gender. And this, of course, is exacerbated by class and race and all of the intersections. So I wanted to highlight that as one of the things that we've done to ensure one of our solutions that's very community-based, and it is very empowerment-focused. And CAISO works directly with a slew of referrals around gender-based violence from the Coalition Against Domestic Violence here in Trinidad and Tobago, and Living Water Community that works with migrants as well as other organizations to offer access to justice. And I think that is that's the model that we've created through years and years of organizing work. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, please go ahead, Jessica.
Thank you very much. I will, in a perfect world, I think the best solution that I have said over and over again, which has become my anthem now, is to completely eliminate men from leadership structures in the Southern Africa region. I think that would be the biggest step forward towards gender equity, is to remove men from the government and replace them with women. That would be great. However, because it's not the perfect world, I will say that I think three things need to happen for us to get to a point where we can start seeing progress with regards to ending violence against women. And the first is to implement comprehensive sex and sexuality education in our education curriculums, for adolescents and teenagers, to start learning issues of consent and respect for each other's bodies, to also understand their rights as human beings, and also to start dismantling the different social and gender norms that as young girls and boys in Africa were raised to believe is our reality. I think that would be the best step for us. We've seen with different countries that have started implementing comprehensive sexual education, where it has helped start dismantling the systems of
Okay, I'm afraid the connection is breaking up.
Violence and the systems of oppression within the little boys and patriarchal governments. Can you hear me now?
It's a little bit shaky. We can hear you on and off. Please try again now.
Okay. Okay. So the second point I was going to mention is for us to end patriarchal governments. For Malawi, for example, for us to actually implement the 60-40 representation, because we refused as a country to implement 50-50 representation because of culture. So we opted for 60-40 representation. So to actually implement 60-40 representation and to put, you know, a fairer representation in key positions such as the cabinet ministers. At the moment, we have less than 30%, and the majority of the women are put into deputy positions as opposed to the key positions. So to actually implement 60-40 representation. And lastly, to encourage the intersectional, intergeneration united front of activism. For many years, the feminist movement has sort of been not unified, where younger feminists are doing their own thing and older feminists are doing their own thing, but to actually come together and have one united front to say we are tired of the nonsense that's happening right now and we want change, and to go for that change and to embrace the different approaches and come together as one to say we're going to lobby, we're going to advocate, but we're also going to be disruptive in order for us to end the violence against women. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to jump in with one question from the audience, where it's asked, should restorative justice be an alternative to the criminal system, or should they be complementary? And how much power can or should we give to victims or survivors to decide this? So maybe some of you that have done some research or work on restorative justice, what is your answer to this? Is it complementary to the criminal system, or is it just a completely different way? And, yeah?
I think based on our situation, maybe criminal justice is important when you have a sovereign entity. But in our case, which we don't, restorative justice is becoming very important because it creates social peace among communities where there is no public authority. And restorative justice, as I said, it is important in healing the individual and the community and the family in the meanwhile, because sometimes criminal justice could do harm more than benefit, unless, you know, general conditions are favorable in applying this criminal justice based on society participation. And if we have a criminal justice that includes social participation, it could be just for the different classes, for the different groups of women, for the different communities. But in most cases, we don't have this participatory approach for criminal justice. So I would vote, if I can, for restorative justice, because it could be comprehensive, and also it could deal with power structures on the micro level. On the micro level, which the law most of the time doesn't take into consideration. The law is the law for everyone, irrespective, rich or poor, capable or incapable, old or young, while restorative justice could take all these differences into consideration and be more just for the different individuals and the different communities.
Thank you, and thank you very much for this context-specific. It's very important to think about the different contexts in on this matter. Claire and Julia, do you have anything to add to this discussion on the solutions, and particularly on restorative justice?
Sure thing. I think in my talk, I tried to sort of cram in as many examples as possible. Yeah. So I could just kind of go back over those. But I really think centered self-accountability for survivors is crucial. So thinking, I think it kind of alluded to in your question, like, are survivors allowed to ask for this? Are survivors allowed to want this? And when should we listen to survivors and when should we not, that kind of thing. I think that kind of centered self-accountability work for survivors is really great at sort of like really connecting with what you need and where your boundaries are. So I would definitely always go back to that. And also thinking about what's different about transformative justice to restorative justice, possibly in a UK context, is that I think restorative justice is way more friendly with the criminal justice system, and it can also be an alternative avenue that can be offered, whereas transformative justice is completely chaotic in some kinds of ways. So it is very much more aligned with abolitionist ideas. It's very much, engaging with what would it take to transform the conditions that enable violence to happen in the first place, and what can we do to change them and shift them. So it's maybe much more of the destructive kind of ideas that I think Jessica was talking to, and then knowing that maybe isn't a reality in our lifetime, but what small steps can we take towards that as a community and as a group. So that's why I think I've got to, with my thinking on this, is what are the practical tools to develop those networks of safety and accountability and strengthen our knowledge about ourselves, as well as our connections with others. So yeah, I kind of would maybe give a shout out to the healing justice movement that Angelique has talked about. There are groups happening in the UK as well as places like Cradle Community, which are really bringing together people to think really practically about what is a boundary, what is my relationship to myself, what are my needs and what are other people's needs, and how do I navigate those? Mm-hmm. I think for potentially us in Britain anyway, through the education I've experienced, there isn't much education around that, which maybe links into the relationship with sex education that's been mentioned as well. But we really don't have those kinds of skills around conflict, around understanding our own needs, around what it's like to step outside of the kind of cultural norms of what it is to be a person in relationship with other people. And so I think to that work when I think about transformative justice. But yeah, Claire will probably say something different about restorative justice to me. But I see transformative justice, which is what I'm more interested in, as a bit distinct and a bit more abolitionist in its kind of outlook and thinking, as well as very practical steps towards the kind of developing the skills that we need to develop to create the world that we want to live in, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you. We are really coming to an end now. We have just a very few minutes left. So I see that Sotheary has raised her hand. And if there's anyone else that would like to say something before we close. Yes, I see you. Please, go ahead, Sotheary.
Keep it short. I'll go for both. It's complementing to each other is the way I choose and the way I prefer. And I say this because it's not just for myself. I think if I experience it, I would also do the same. But I've said it for the survivors I have worked with. We cannot rely on justice from the tribunal, from the court, but the justice, the own definition of justice is needed, because once you relied on the justice out of your hands, far of your reach, it could create dissatisfactions, could create more angers, could create, and the worst case is that they has no hopes in life anymore. So for me, I go for both. And as I said, I said it for myself, and I said it from what I heard from survivors. And I know when we work, we try to be inclusive enough, but sometimes we do not do enough. So both is my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Angelique and Islah, I see that you raised your hands. Please, just a very quick comment.
Yeah, I want to agree about that we have to work from both perspectives. I do think that restorative justice can get very much pulled into the criminal justice system. But we're not, in the Caribbean, we're not even there yet. We're still trying to ensure that conversations about rehabilitation are infused in some of the ways that the justice system works and in fact doesn't work. So I think transformation, agreeing with others on the panel that we have to destroy these systems, we have to rebuild them. And if we're thinking from an abolitionist perspective and a survivor empowerment perspective, these systems do not work for the majority of people. They are filled with colonial ideas, white supremacy, racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and on and on. And so until we have to transform, we have to rebuild and create the world that we want to live in. And I know that there are folks who want to work within systems, and I feel like we've done that for decades and it hasn't worked. So we absolutely need to stop. We need to stop investing in those systems that don't work for us, and we have to take it back and transform.
Thank you. Islah?
No, I didn't raise my hand.
Oh, you didn't raise your hand, sorry. Okay, thank you so much. We've learned today that there are so many structures of oppression that hinder the realization of justice, and we've heard everything from very radical ideas of getting rid of men in government to some very focused and some very practical things to implement to provide a little bit more justice to survivors. And probably we'll be using all of these tools that we have and everything that we can do to destroy systems and rebuild them. And thank you so much. This is the end of panel 1. Thank you.